Hello, beautiful community. I'm sorry to be late. I'm so sorry I've kept you 5 minutes. Let me know if you can hear me. And I'm just going to scroll to the beginning. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to be here at the bottom of the chat first and see if you're telling that you can hear me. Great. So let's go to the beginning and see what kind of questions were there. I see Russia placing tactical nukes in Belarus as a political story, first and foremost, part of nuclear blackmail aimed at reducing military support for Ukraine. Europe is to a good extent asleep, and everybody's watching Trump in America. So we are going to be a very small group. The difficulty, Matt, who is asking about the Orthodox Church, is that the top of the church is really a government department. You can just think of it like that, like a branch of propaganda, basically. But it's a very complex organization when you go lower down. And I think it actually takes an expert to properly analyze what the hell is going on. But if you look at the top of the church, it's there to fulfill a function, much the way the fake opposition parties in Russia are there to fulfill a function. The Communist Party is not really the Communist Party; it's a Kremlin department. I saw Dominic asking a few questions early on. Let me have a look. If the Ukrainian offensive fizzles out, what will that mean for Western support for Ukraine? Dominic's asking. Bad. It'll be bad. So the better Ukraine does with the counteroffensive, the easier it will be for the West to sustain strong military support. So the contingency of that is something that's a vulnerability for everyone who wants Ukraine to do really well against the Russians. And, you know, the track record is that on balance, the Russians have underperformed, the Ukrainians have overperformed. But we need to see what happens. It's very important for Ukraine that the counteroffensive is as successful as possible, and that will correlate, I think, with how things look with support in terms of weapons coming in and other kinds of support. One distinction to make between the way the Russians respond to the way the Kremlin is seeing Ukrainians and the way they see other ethnic groups in within Russia's borders is that there is a kind of peculiar colonialism that applies to Ukraine and a more conventional colonialism that applies to the groups in Russia, in Russia's territory. The conventional colonialism is clearly exemplified in Chechnya, where the attitude is, well, you guys are different to us, but we could potentially civilize you, although we can't do that at the moment. That's conventional colonial psychology. And that's very different to how the Kremlin sees Ukraine. Ukraine is not a different group that needs to be civilized. They are Russians. We've said this many times already. They're Russians who've forgotten their Russian, according to the Kremlin. Whereas Chechens are certainly not Russians who've forgotten their Russian. Chechens are non-Russians who might benefit from, you know, being part of Russian civilization. So a conventional and unconventional colonialism there. Ferrari guy, I have a strong degree of support, a strong degree of confidence in post-war support for rebuilding Ukraine, if and when Ukraine wins. But that doesn't mean Ukraine is not going to face extreme challenges. Hello to you in Murmansk. dark fire. Let's have a look. Yeah, the Belarusian story, Belarusian nuke story, I would, in the first instance, see as scaring the West away from supporting Ukraine militarily. Um, Ben Shields is asking, do you believe that AI poses an existential risk to humanity? Yes. Do you believe that it poses an existential risk to humanity in the short, medium term? No. Um, do I believe it's the main or even the second or third risk that humanity faces? No, I don't. The people who are good at analyzing the risks of AI are often the very people who are really bad at analyzing political risks. I mean, so in other words, if you thought that the risk of AI was greater as an existential threat to humanity than the risk of nuclear war, you would need to think again. Tom is saying, I've kept him sane. Very kind. I haven't kept you sane. You've kept yourself sane. Um, Peter from Florida. Hi. Thank you for the good wishes. Hello, Kim. Haven't been to Belgium for a very long time, actually. Marcus is asking, can we build healthy democratic institutions from scratch in the modern world? No. They need to be responsive to the particular challenges and limitations we face. Um, well, some of the differences in terms of the ex-Soviet republics democratizing is that uh, uh, some of them were much less Sovietized than others, and so it's easier to build a political project that's apart from what came before. Um, if Russia loses, the impact on all of Russia's geopolitical spheres of influence will depend on what shape Russia takes and whether Russia stays intact. Chris is asking, Ben Hodges makes the case that foreign investment needed to rebuild Ukraine will never come unless Ukraine secures Crimea and the Sea of Azov. Do you agree? We need to see what happens. It's not even clear that there'll be security for Ukraine if Ukraine takes Crimea. If Ukraine takes Crimea and the Putin regime is still in power, the Putin regime will fire rockets at Ukraine, plausibly. Why not? So we've got a real problem working out what it means for the war to end in a way that brings Ukraine peace and sustainable security. Funky Fudge is asking, support from the West for Ukraine dies down as the excitement dies down. Politically, how can the West keep up the support? Especially considering the upcoming elections. Thank you so much. I think that we've sort of had to go at this question from different directions at different times. And I think that some of this is just sort of room by room stuff if we're talking about persuading citizens. I don't believe that the compassion argument is primary. In other words, the argument that we're helping Ukraine because Ukraine is attacked by an evil genocidal tyranny, that doesn't really sustain. The argument that sustains is about the key interests of Western states. And that means getting clear about exactly the kind of project of escalation that's happening in the Kremlin. Um, because imagine a completely different situation where Ukraine was told by the Kremlin, we're going to chop off 30% of your territory. And we've always wanted that. We've never wanted more. We're never going to invade anybody else. We don't want to dissolve NATO. We don't want to take over Eastern Europe. That kind of proposal would be disaster for Ukraine, but the Western response would be very different. So the key thing to focus is on what is the ambition and intent and strategy of escalation in the Kremlin. Um, and that being properly reflected upon leaves us with the thought that Ukraine's in the firing line, but the target is actually us. It's just that Ukraine's taking the hits for us at the moment. So um, that's one thread in that important conversation, Funky Fudge, that you raise. Um, but I think also in terms of this room by room approach, it's important not to freak out at people. Oh, how dare you, not be interested in Ukraine? Or how dare you, having had interest but now lost it? No, we need to engage with the actual feelings of fellow citizens, not with the feelings we would like them to have. James is asking, what do these three things mean for Ukraine? The ICC warrant for Putin, Finland and NATO, and Trump in trouble. Um, how are they related? Trump in trouble, the way Trump is in trouble at the moment, probably helps. Probably helps Putin. So we need to see what happens. But uh, you know, so this is a very there'll be questions about it. I bet. I'm not sure if I'm going to go there, but at the moment, what is happening is consolidating his odds of being the Republican nominee, and there's a dramatic underestimation in establishment Democrat circles about what it looks like when Trump runs against Biden, and it does not look that pretty if you would prefer Biden to win. It looks like a coin toss. So i- i- the Trump story is absolutely fascinating. Um, it's um, it's a story about how a democracy deals with political candidates with anti-democratic ambitions to do with breaking the workings of institutions. Sorry if I'm going to lose a couple of you here, but Trump is what one would call an exclusionary anti-democratic populist. Exclusionary means that he deals not with all of the population, all of citizens, but he pits some against others. Anti-democratic means he wants to break certain checks and balances and counter majoritarian institutions. Um, and Trump's not, appearing out of thin air. He is in many ways a reflection of many important forces and sentiments in American politics that need to be taken really seriously, not dismissed as irrational, not dismissed as sort of uh, aberrations. Um, and so there can be many very counterproductive ways of trying to clamp down on a political candidate like that can in fact backfire for your democracy. We'll probably be pushed on this a bit more this time, maybe another time. So we will see Um, but it certainly can't be argued at the moment that that what's happened so far has reduced Trump's chances of being the nominee. I've lost a few super thanks. Fourth Jude, thank you so much. I fear I've lost a few super thanks. So I'm going to just scroll up a bit. I saw a couple. I'm going to find you guys. Jonesy, thank you so much. Eric, thank you. No questions and no's. Very good. What just happened? Funky Fudge, thank you so much. Cheers to you back in Poland. A few comments about 420. Oh, what is the situation? Sven is saying, it'd be interesting to hear Vlad's comments on the situation with 420, the Vox Pop channel. It seems the channel has special privileges. Anybody want to say if something's recently happened that I'm missing? Yeah, 420. Did something happen with 420, guys, that I'm missing? Otherwise, I'm going to give you my generic thoughts. I'll give you my generic thoughts. It's tricky. It's tricky because I think that there's so much that's wonderful about a project like that. Oh, how is 420 still working in Russia? 420 is still working because 1420 is still working because it's geared at a foreign audience and because there is no editorial anti-war line that is overt that the channel pushes, except just what the people say on the street. And I think it's beautifully done. But it is a bit it is difficult. It's difficult because you are to some extent looking at, and I don't want to exaggerate this. This is not Russia is not North Korea, but when you're watching 1420, and this is the sort of difficulty that channel has to balance. You're watching hostages speak about their hostage situation with the pretense that they're not hostages, right? If you approached me now and you said, "Well, I live in God knows where, doesn't matter, Moscow, um, and I just know that I'm going to be stopped by the 1420 guys tomorrow, and I have very anti-war views. Should I speak to them?" I would say absolutely not. Absolutely not. So that means two things. That means that there's a real possibility of needless endangerment of people. And that's a significant risk for that channel. Um, that's something it could be complicit in. And then the other thing is that it obviously tilts against people who are going to speak out against the war. It tilts against people who are going to speak against the war because we now have had cases where people doing vox pop have been arrested. So we've seen these cases. coming out of Russia. So that's what I would say is a tricky balance there. So when you watch it, uh, try to calculate in for the misrepresentative tilt, right, that you're getting, um, inevitably, because a sound thinking person who's concerned about their safety will probably not speak to 1420 if they're against the war. Um, there's a lot of people who are sort of fuzzy about where things are at, and what they're saying is not so committal, so they kind of say it and they're probably going to be fine. But there's an issue there, yeah, and that affects both, I think, how you should evaluate the sort of the balance of responses, but it also creates a sort of ethical dilemma for the channel. It carries that risk that people could get into trouble. Um, so these are some of my thoughts around that balancing act. My recommendation at the moment would be, if you're stopped on the street for vox pop in Russia, you're against the war. Um, don't do the damn vox pop, because you're not going to achieve anything. You're not going to harm the Putin regime that way, um, but you could end up in trouble. So that's the dilemma with it at the moment. It's still the repression is still pointillistic enough that most people just get away with it. Okay, let's go back, catch a few questions that have just come in as I've been raving on. But I mean, there's so much that's really lovely about that work, but we've got to be very careful about sort of weighing the sort of the finished product, and the sort of inevitable balance that has. Vanessa is saying, from the body language of Putin and Xi, both looking smug, and the fact that China hasn't really coughed up what Putin wants, might she want Russia to lose? No. The last thing that China wants is the collapse of the Putin regime. Um, so that's an um, absolute no-no, unless they're confident that it won't be replaced by a pro-Western regime with democratic tendencies. Then they might be okay. So it's not that they're addicted to Putin in any way. They don't care if Putin is gone tomorrow. Um, but they wouldn't want um, a regime with a radically different geopolitical course. Um, and Russia is now a very advantageous asset for China to exploit, not just in terms of resource and economic advantage, but in terms of, to some extent, curating Russia's uh, uh, foreign policy. I think that's where we're going to move a bit. Micho is saying, is the reaction toward Trump, who is anti-democratic in its nature, anti-democratic too? Um, I think that there is some such dilemma, yes. And one of the problems is that those forces, institutions that might be trying to take Trump down might do the opposite if they're not the right forces and institutions to take him down, if others should try to take him down instead. Um, and we're talking about things that don't just need to be sufficiently um, non-politically motivated, right? They also need to look like they're not very politically motivated. And the lighter and more frivolous the charge, the more political it's going to look. So there is always this balance. And that's why I actually had a little chat about this without reference to American politics recently. I talked about how in 1996 in Russia, anti-democratic steps were taken to make sure that the Democratic Party won. So there were anti-democratic moves to make sure that Yeltsin, the more democratic of the two candidates, won. Well, Will, you're disagreeing with me that it might be a coin toss against Biden. We're going to see. It's uncertain what it is. But I remember months and months ago, I got a lot of mail from American uh, viewers, Democrat, Republican, and indeed neither, saying that my analysis wasn't correct about Trump's good chances of becoming president again, and that DeSantis was clearly gonna beat him for the nomination. And so, what was wrong with all of these letters? It's not that they ignored the fact that they actually follow American politics, even though they don't discuss it much at the moment. What they ignored is that the forces that are producing Trump are not American forces fundamentally. Right? They're global forces, right? And they're generating things similar to Trump all over the place. And in this sense, you are absolutely going to be unable to understand Trump, um, even if you follow him with hatred or admiration, if you only follow American politics. An American only explanation of Trump is not going to be able to explain Trump. And not going to be explain the rise of particular species of right populism. Nicholas, thank you so much. Billy is asking a classical music question. If you had to build a 3 to 5 song playlist of classical music to put one in a good headspace to interact with news, I would actually, for that, Billy, try to not pick the best pieces. I would pick some lighter pieces, maybe some early pieces by Mozart, possibly performed on period instruments. If you're going to listen to classical music as background, my strong advice is try to not listen to the best pieces, because they are going to be too they need to be listened with great concentration or not at all, and as background they might not work very well for you. So I actually think that you want the least sophisticated pieces of an early works by major composers, and then if you have to listen to them as background, these are the ones to go for. So like early symphonies of Mozart, he wrote when he was 8, 10, 12. Monsieur Nothing is saying, Mark Lilla is interesting. You've mentioned Lilla and hyperidentity politics before. Nebulous buzzwords are totally no, they're not nebulous buzzwords. You're not going to have a definition, Monsieur Nothing, of a concept that describes a socio-political cultural phenomena. You're going to have to capture it as it is and then tag a word to it. Virtually nothing that is an interesting political descriptor is definable, because it has a history, and that history is contingent. So the fact that you can't define a certain term doesn't mean it's unconstructive. I think that the way we learn about how to better talk about such things is to talk about these things better. And I must say, there's a real problem here. Let me just make a sort of side comment that I think raises an important point that your question, in fact, is really touching on too. And that's that we have got a terrible problem, and we've just spoken about Trump, so that applies too. There, we've got a terrible problem with people being unable to have conversations that their audiences are not comfortable with. Right? We've got a situation where media has a problem having conversations that its viewers, its readers, its subscribers are not comfortable with. And so, one of the things we need to do here for such conversations is to create that culture. And you create that culture firstly by having these conversations, but also by having conversations about these conversations. And that means that you always have to explore issues of responsibility and issues of trust. Whether you're a YouTube platform, whether you are a newspaper, whether you're something else, Because what we've got is a situation where as soon as people try to take their audience in an uncomfortable place, right, the audience plonks and leaves. So this is something we really, really need to take very seriously and to deal with. And that is partly why I go on about my, beautiful community and so on, because one has to build something that is uh, independent of making the case for this or against that. We have to build a situation which is somehow a weak, but nevertheless an alternative to us all sitting in some kind of a village bar, where we can come in night after night, and there's a certain minimal establishment of, if not sort of epistemic trust and trust about intent. Um, so this is very, very important, that we have to create dynamics that facilitate platforms to engage their audiences by challenging them. That's really, really an important part of having any such conversation. Um, I mean, the problem with the conversation about hyper identity politics, it is really badly stuck between people who partake in the problem and don't recognize it, and people who try to shoot it down in a way that is, in many ways, just absurd and farcical. They misdescribe it, they entrepreneurially leverage it for their own personal success and growth. So there is simply an absence of an adequate conversation there. And when that happens, you almost have to sort of build the little clearing in the forest before you begin building a tent there. So this is difficult. But I think that this is part of having conversations about how we have conversations. I'm really a big believer in this. Eric, thank you so much. But I do think the way Mark Liller uses terms like identity politics is not nebulous, um, is real. Um, RSH, I would love to talk to you more about your love of Beethoven. Um, when we do a Q&A on the music channel. I'm a great admirer of 96% of Beethoven's output. Um, DG Lloyd is asking, saying, you've said that fact checking can be harmful and that labeling those who oppose Western aid to Ukraine as Russian paid is also harmful, or even as Russian assets. What's your take then on NAFO fellas? Um, what's my take on NAFO? I haven't um, done a kind of picture, a landscape picture to myself yet, so I can't judge. Um, so my exposure at the moment is limited. I mean, have I had some absolutely ridiculous conversations with people with that hashtag? Yeah, I have. The last one was, I must say, quite toxic. I wasn't participating in it except just peripherally. But Alexander Etkind, the academic at the Central European University, has just published a book about why this war that Putin has started is not just disastrous, but somehow is a kind of a denial of ineliminable conditions of the modern world. And over and above that, Alexander Etkind takes roughly Ben Hodges's view, right, of how much we need to support Ukraine and what a Ukrainian victory means. But what is done is, it says Russia Against Modernity on his book cover. So Russia is mentioned with the word Russia, but the actual book cover is the Ukrainian flag. And a lot of people came along and said that that's sort of exploitation for his you're not going to make any money on a damn book like that. But it's exploitation of Ukraine for his own self-promotion, right? And that's a very that's position taken by several people um, online, and I would categorize that as a non-discursive position. It's a position I would not engage with, except just by calling it irrational and not negotiating with it. So the argument is that you can't put the Ukrainian flag on the book cover because it uses um, the suffering um, and extraordinary difficulties that Ukrainian people are going through um, as something that you sort of, leverage your book success off. Um, well, the damn flag's on the book cover because the guy supports Ukraine all the way and keeps retweeting Ben Hodges. Um, so that is actually an example of toxic identity politics. And funnily enough, this is an important distinction. It's crept into Ukraine. And it's a big part of Ukrainian online rhetoric. And what's interesting is that the complete sort of quarrelsome absurdity of the Russian opposition isn't that. It can look like it, but it isn't that. Um, they are quarreling with themselves and trying to cancel each other for non-identity politics reasons. But this is creeping in. It's not Ukrainian phenomenon, actually. It comes from the West, and so that's an example of one of several examples, which I think is completely politically unconstructive and indeed toxic. I mean, you're telling one of the most academically articulate advocates for a complete Ukrainian victory, and he was also an explainer of the unmitigated disastrousness of Russian imperialism, who also happens to think that Russia probably should and will collapse into little bits. And you're having a go at that guy for saying basically that he's with Ukraine by putting the Ukrainian flag on his book cover. I mean, and this is not an isolated incident. This is very, very unconstructive, and it's apolitical, right? So a feature of certain kind of hyper identity politics is that it's an apolitical way of engaging with politics, because obviously you want Alexander Etkind as an ally if you want a full Ukrainian victory and you're opposed to Russian imperialism. So that's an example, but I haven't done a cumulative assessment. So it may be just that there's this little bits of unconstructive stuff, and the vast majority of NAFO stuff is constructive and positive. I haven't got that picture yet. So, Sleeping Beauty, thank you. Let's have a look. I'm going to go right down, in fact. And see where we are. Got an Argentinian living in Berlin. Should Latin American countries sacrifice economic opportunities to undermine Russia? Well, look, I think globally speaking, one of the problems is that much of the world has not got sufficient motivation to come out and say, no, this Russian stuff is terrible. We're not going to accept it or side with it. Why is that motivation absent? What does that say about our global arrangements and how they might need to be improved and how different incentives should be given to countries? So I think the key thing here is that this gets us going with a conversation about global political and economic imbalances and inequities. And we'll be having these conversations more. Hello back, Kodos. Let us have a look where we're at. Reza is saying, I was wondering if a possible rise in eco-fascism, green authoritarianism. Um, I look. I think that um, whatever we do, the climate agenda will spread across the ideological spectrum. Um, that's what I'm saying is inevitable by the 2030s, no matter what we do. Let's have a look. Test Trekkie is saying, thank you for broadcasting. I feel that the modern left identity based politics are counterproductive if someone wants to stop fascists from taking over. What do you feel is the best way to engage with these groups? Um, one thing that's really important is to talk about the value of citizen belonging. In other words, how to make the argument for whatever thing somebody's making an argument for that becomes an argument in terms of how it's important for all citizens and not just some. I think it's also very important that when there is a clash between identity politics and certain values, like for example free speech in the academy, in the university systems, that these other values are not compromised. Um, and I think it's also important to have a conversation about winning. Um, what is the best way for the cause that somebody has to win? And very often, with certain kinds of hyper identity politics, um, it, you either get no victory or you get uh, a temporary victory followed by various kinds of backlashes. So I think that one conversation is really important. There was a conversation simply about winning. Well, this is your cause. Um, how are you going to win if that's how you're going to go about it? Right. That's a very important line always to press. Sleeping Beauty, thank you. It's what is happening. The culture wars inside our academic institutions are pretty interesting and important because democracies just don't survive without universities. And for all the problems with universities, that is something that folks who work in universities need to very bravely say. Um, because once we lose the idea that there is such a thing as getting things right and such a thing as expertise, um, we, in a certain sense, lose everything. Because once a democracy gets fully detethered from the practiced value of truthfulness, it's out in open space. Um, G Sam is saying, thank you. How accurate do you think Putin's view is of what's happening on the ground? He's very aware of his army's systemic issues and plows on regardless. So I would say that Putin is less delusional about what is happening in Bakhmut than he is about what is happening with um, the prospect of, let us say, Western support for Ukraine, or the prospects of Western democracy, or indeed even the prospect of climate policy in the West and those being abandoned. So Putin's biggest delusions are still the big picture delusions. So as much as we've seen evidence of um, uh, micro delusions from Putin um, during the war, I think his biggest delusions are still those big picture delusions about the imminent collapse of the West and so on. Um, I would not be surprised if his information were compromised about what's happening on the ground, but I think that there are, I mean, both mechanisms for self-correction there, um, and in some ways you just hit a brick wall, and he's obviously going to be able to see certain things. If the Russian um, armies, attempts to make territorial progress just falters, Putin is not going to be unaware of that, obviously. Um, Another thing I would add is that he genuinely does not use the internet. That is not a joke. He genuinely does not use the internet. And the importance here is not just lack of access to information, it's lack of access to um, how some elementary bits of the infrastructure of our world work. So I think still Putin's biggest delusions are the big picture stuff about how he's going to defeat the West. Let's have a look. Yeah, I think Ben Hodges looks to me like he has real integrity. Eric, thank you. Question about American politics and resisting soft fascism. I think that there is a balance between two things when your democracy is going a bit off the rails and you feel things are happening that shouldn't be. And it's a very important balance to get right in each case. You can say, no, I don't accept what's happening. I'm against this. Stop this now. It's unacceptable. And there is, what did we do to bring about the situation that we have now? So it's a balance between putting up your hand and saying, I won't stand for this, and saying, how did we get here? What is behind what is happening now? And what is behind the thing that's behind that? And so on. And it's a very, very important balance. So when things are going off the rails, you will eventually lose if all you do is just put up your hand and say, this is unacceptable, and this is fascism or soft fascism. Because we're not gonna collectively understand what the mechanisms of the deformation are. For example, a systemic loss of trust in public institutions, let's say. But at the same time, if we just always keep saying, well, let's evaluate how we've got here, and we don't raise our hand and say no, that's also not going to work. So that's a fine balance. The other thing I would add, D, to that answer about fact checking and calling folks who are sympathetic to the Kremlin Russian assets. If you're an activist for Ukraine, like Jake Bro is, for example, then being sort of selective in that direction is completely legitimate. So it also depends on who you are. But if you make your support for Ukraine secondary to other aims, such as, I don't know, analyzing political reality and so on, then there's certain things you shouldn't do. And there's room for both, right? So, for example, a lot of you guys watch advocate channels for Ukraine. They're not channels that in the first instance give political analysis, for example. They advocate and then they give analysis. And if that's what one's doing, that's perfect. The problem only arises when there is a disconnect between what one's mission is and then what one's in fact offering. Um, so that's part of the answer too. Let us have a look. Zero Fox, given what do you think about the current deterioration in the UK, social, politically, and economically? The United Kingdom is very divided. It's not as divided as the United States. And the United Kingdom has two political parties in existential crisis. And historically, the Conservative Party in the UK is better at coming out of existential crisis than the Labour Party. Um, the Tory Party is in crisis at the moment, but the political opposition in the UK, the Labour Party, has a fundamental crisis of identity and has failed to process its own recent history and therefore explain to itself what it is and how it tries to solve the problems um, in modern Britain. Um, so things do not look pretty. On the positive side, UK political institutions are very resilient, so you can batter them quite a lot before they snap. But they're snappable. McCipher is saying social media is the great piano upon which our enemies play. Their propaganda machines. Considering this, can normal politics ever return? No, it can't. The economic fluidity of our societies, and then two or three other factors, including the shape of the internet, which represents our public square, means that certain things that historically held our societies together now never can. This is happening to our societies. They're coming apart. One of the reasons they're coming apart is the shape of the internet, and that is insoluble, except in bits and pieces here and there. So yes, the shape of the internet irreversibly transforms, among other things too, um, uh, um, our democratic possibilities. That does not mean democracies are going to collapse, but it means that that they're under more strain at the level of civic values, values that are to do with citizens feeling that they um, stably belong to their polity. Yeah. So back to you, Zero Fox. Given if Labour in the UK won a general election tomorrow, British politics would remain in crisis. This is the problem. Whoever wins, we have problems. We'll talk more about that. Horse 1066 is saying Labour activists abandon the working class for identity politics. The leadership doesn't know how to react to this. So the current leadership of the Labour Party, I mean, Keir, people in my life have spent time with Keir. He's a very nice man. And he is not a massive identity politics guy. So some of Labour buying into identity politics heavily is pragmatic, but that's not even the issue. The issue is what is the Labour Party today? And that's an unanswered question that the party needs to answer that question. So, for instance, um, the Labour Party has not processed the Blair years at all, and now relates to them like you would relate to a relationship you've had in the past that you've blocked out. And so I ask you, you know, horse 10066, what were you doing for these 3 years? And you say, well, before I was with that person, and then after I was with this person. But that these years, it was like it's like a blank. I don't really go there anymore. I don't even know what happened. Um, so that's very, very problematic, that the labor period has simply been sort of written out of labor history. It doesn't have a relationship to that period, the party now, and it should have some kind of relationship. It could be a relationship that says we are not that at all, and here is why. But there's at the moment just amnesia there. So there's a real identity crisis. What do we as the Labour Party say about the world as it is and Britain as it is today? What's our approach? These questions are, in my view, unanswered, and that's really problematic. John is saying, which US politician, past or present, do you like? I'd probably have a lot of positive things to say about FDR. Um, if I were American and I were voting, see, there's an ethical issue here. I think that there's a limit to how far you can talk about politicians from a country where you don't vote. So there is a difference in the way I would talk about British politics and the way I would talk about any other country's politics. It's not a massive difference, but there's a difference because I'm involved. Um, in the United States, I would have been voting reluctantly for anybody. So anybody who was um, in any of the recent Democratic or Republican races, I would have been voting for them reluctantly. Um, and I would have been voting on criteria like democratic decline and the climate crisis and so on. But I think that um, the problem is that um, US democracy would have declined a little bit whoever won, for example, in 2016, whoever won. Um, but I do think there is a case to be made that it would have declined less with certain candidates. Um, so that's what I would say. That there isn't anybody who I would have voted for in the party races, and then who I would have voted for as president, about whom I would have felt, yeah, this is really, really good. No, I would have felt bad about everybody. And that just shows how difficult it is to generate a politician who will tick enough boxes such that it'll both work electorally, but also not undermine um, democracy. We've got almost a kind of an insoluble problem whereby what works electorally hurts democracy. Well, look, I mean, in terms of what Poland and Ukraine have in common, one thing they have in common are various appropriate narratives about Russian imperialism. Um, so that's one thing I would mention there. Savara, if Z folks would keep getting um, ending up in a Tatarsky situation, would it strengthen Putin's position as they're a dangerous type of opposition, or would it weaken Putin's position due to perceived inability of a state to stop these attacks? Great question. So the difference between their Telegram channels and propaganda media is that the Telegram channels have a much less formal relationship with the Kremlin. The propaganda media sort of go to the Kremlin and they're accountable. They aren't necessarily given orders, but they're accountable and they're clear about what lanes they operate in. These folks have a much looser relationship. Um, they're still in and around power, they still have connections, and they still talk to the regime, um, and they still meet many of the regime's needs, but they're operating in a slightly looser orbit. And sometimes they serve the regime's interests when the regime benefits from having a party that is more radical than them. Sometimes they undermine the regime by criticizing it, eviscerating it, and so on. But if you look at somebody like Girkin, Girkin is obviously allowed to speak, right? In good part because it benefits the regime. What Girkin does also hurts the regime a bit, but it benefits the regime on balance more than it hurts it. The regime judges, and so he is allowed to, do this. Um, More attacks on radical Z folks, would they strengthen Putin's position or weaken Putin's position? I think it simply depends on where the attacks are coming from and how that fits into Putin balancing what we've labeled the sort of ongoing totalitarian turn in the country. You see, it may be that an attack like that could have a mobilizing effect, and then it's beneficial. If it's clear that it doesn't, then it's not beneficial to the regime. Um, so um, it it simply depends, and some of the uncertainties are how the regime will manage to mobilize events like that if it wants to mobilize the population around events like this, if it even wants to do that. Um, I think so far the attitude to this attack from the regime has been to brush it under the carpet a bit. So they didn't even use the word. Some of the Russian propaganda media didn't even use the word explosion. So let's have a look. SideQuest Hero, hi, thank you, is asking, do you have any recommended reading for someone studying international relations with a focus on Russia and Eastern Europe? Um, if you're studying international relations, the recommended readings would obviously be outside of international relations. So you get a multidisciplinary perspective. So you would probably need some cultural history. And perhaps here the work of somebody like Professor Zorin is really important, who I mentioned a couple of times in the Crimea video. I also think that you just run into an automatic problem if you're doing like an undergrad or a master's or even a PhD, that the academic stuff is not catching up on time with what's happening. It just can't. Academic work is always a year or two behind. And that's why now people at academic conferences about Ukraine are complaining that too many of the papers are about 2014 and so on. So this takes time. So for currency, I'd focus on um, a few platforms that are giving um, up to date contemporary analysis. Russia, RE slash Russia, is a very good platform um, run by Kirill Rogov, and some of their analysis um, is in English. Um, there's a new podcast by Arkady Ostrovsky, who does the Russia coverage for The Economist, that I also very much recommend. And then another very important warning is that in many ways, the IR study situation in Russia and Eastern Europe is a mess because it's got a big shadow of Sovietology over it. And that's really important to watch out for, because what folks are doing is basically thinking that Russia is still the Soviet Union and mapping their analysis onto that um, uh, presumption. And that is such an astonishingly erroneous presumption that it's really worth being careful about it. This project has very little to do with Soviet communism, what we've got coming out of the Kremlin today. So, and I know people who worked in Sovietology in the 70s and 80s, and it's a challenge for them to change their goggles. So I think that's also another problem that I'd watch out for. I just follow really good scholars who are doing good stuff, um, who are of the younger generation. That's also important, and who have a sense of the region. Also, that's very important. Folks who've spent time in Eastern Europe, folks who've spent time in Russia. I will be recommending um, a kind of resource or reading list. So maybe just keep an eye out for that, both on Twitter and on YouTube. Micho is asking about the primary system in US elections. I think that the roots of polarization are fundamentally deeper than that in US politics, and they are um, they're worth analyzing in depth, and we will do this. But no institutional reform of any kind would simply remove them. These are deep, deep problems that we have to live with and ongoingly um, engage with. Let's have a look. Unwashed masses. What do you make of Russia's involvement in the Balkans? The third political power in Bulgaria wants to align us with Russia and pull out. There's a lot of latent pro Russian political energy all over Europe, all over Europe, and that energy will come out if it looks like Putin is not losing. So this is very, very important that we don't underestimate that. So we're gonna see what happens over the months to come. But this is all over the place. This is true in so many countries, true in Germany too. Um, there's plenty of latent Putin sympathy that is pretty ready to come out, that would have electoral backing. And so it's important to take that seriously, but also to take it piece by piece, country by country, um, and figure out the local dynamics every time. Let's have a look where we are. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with me. Side quest hero. Yeah, my answers are just so limited. I'm covering, 8% of what should be given in any of the answers to all the excellent questions, but I gave it a tiny bit of a go. But I will be doing a reading list. D Shark, thank you so much. Um, One of the main reasons, Denise, why there is latent Putin support is a loss of trust in institutions, um, and the idea that your institutions, your political system needs a good shakeup. And it's a fascinating conversation to have about the connections between the populist right in Europe and the Putin regime, basically. Um, and it's important that we emphasize, Grace, thank you so much for being you too. It's important that we emphasize that even though there are such links, we shouldn't assume that these political forces are somehow external and not native to the countries they come from. They're really real. And we can't just blame them on malign foreign forces. Kevin, what would Stalin think of Putin? That Putin is afraid to put his knuckle down on the table properly, and that Putin is afraid of proper meat grinders. He's creating meat grinders in Ukraine, but he is afraid to make the state a meat grinder. Putin is very different to Stalin psychologically, and one of the ironies is that while the Putin regime is not drifting in a Stalinist direction, it's probably drifting in a direction more familiar from European fascism, but it's drifting in a more tyrannical direction. Boris, thank you so much. It's drifting in a more tyrannical direction, um, and Putin welcomes that as part of just the sustenance of the regime. But it's going further than what Putin is comfortable with. Putin is going to have to be more of a tyrant than is natural in his DNA. I mean, I don't think primarily Crawling Man is asking, did Putin take the Ukraine moving toward the EU and the West as a personal rejection? He doesn't think Ukraine has much agency. So he thinks this is not Ukraine moving anywhere. He thinks it's just the United States using Ukraine as a sort of glove. It's put on its fist. There is the element of their us and their forgetting their us, but I do think that's secondary. And the reason it's secondary is because Putin is a real skeptic about Ukraine's agency. Thank you for sharing, Grace. I don't know who Vasya in the Haze is. CS is saying iconology is a tool to help an ideology. Is the Kremlin making an exceptional use of the culture of iconology? Um, I don't know how the answer could be yes here. You know, except that um, they're making use of it in a kind of a garish and kitsch and hideous way. Um, and over and above that, you've got to recognize how secular a country Russia is compared to Poland, for example. Russia is a pretty secular society. That's another really important um, factor here. And that's why the church, the top of the church, can have a kind of a postmodern pliancy too, because people are just going to go along with it. D Shark is saying, what do you think about the statement that fascism is post Marx socialism? Um, I think that statement in itself uh, is somewhere between wrong and completely unilluminating. Um, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. You could mean that there are fascist trends that have a degree of, I don't know, inevitability to them in post communist societies. That could be a line to push. Um, but uh, I I don't see how you're going to tie socialism and fascism. Okay, Vasin has a wonderful Russian Sleeping Beauty says. I haven't read um, The Soviet Tragedy. I'm cursorily familiar with it, but I haven't read it. Let's have a look. Auro Astra, thank you so much. Iconology. Sorry if I've missed some people. Damien is asking, would it be wise for the West to leave a golden bridge upon which the Russians can retreat figuratively or even literally? Or must the bully be violently stopped by all means necessary? So I don't think Russia needs a bridge because the bridge would not stop the war. And the war wouldn't stop, not because Russia is a bully, but because Putin has the idea of um, a big confrontation with the West, with which he has tied the future of his regime, which is why little kiddlywinks in Russian schools now are learning about how they're going to have a big war against the West when they grow up. Um, so it's not that bullies must be stopped, it's that the Putin regime is tied to a pattern of escalation that it cannot abandon. And therefore, that that attempt at escalation needs to be met with a firm response. But not just a firm response, also an understanding of why we're responding like we are and what we want the European space to look like after. Billy is asking, what do we watch for in Russia to know that the rejection of Putin has begun? What you fundamentally watch for is evidence that the depoliticized blob in the middle and the anti-war people are gaining the perception that there is room for constructive action. So at the moment, um, the people who are against the war don't see uh, any space for constructive political action. Um, if they thought that that space was there, they would be readier to risk their necks and even sacrifice their lives to fight the regime. So, um, how do you create that space for action for them? And having that space for action, having the perception that it's there, are not completely separate things. There is a big element of thinking it makes it so here. So that's what is really important. And you recognize it as beginning to happen when you see that people can see beyond the war and beyond the Putin regime, and that they can say, okay, um, this is what we've got, but here are things we can have instead. Here's what they are, here's what they look like, and we're going to start fighting for those. And at the moment, we can observe, unfortunately, that we're far away from that kind of contrast being available. And it's not an easy task, but the Russian opposition have so far dramatically failed to give folks in Russia that sense of an alternative to which there may be constructive, even if very difficult, pathways. So, um, what can we have instead? And no matter how difficult the steps might be, what are the steps we need to take to try to move in that direction? Once you begin to see that that kind of approach becomes available to people, then people are gonna act. So you see what I mean? Um, you're not waiting for people to decide that Putin is bad. You're waiting for action on the position that Putin is bad becoming possible. So, in the beginning was the deed is a basic political truth. Um, you're not looking for people's minds to change. You're looking for their perception of possibilities of action to change. Boom, and then they'll go. Nico is asking, I've heard that the European left is in favor of appeasing different bits of the left, appeasing Russia in some ways in a similar way to the American right. Again, depends on the American right. A lot of the American right is not in favor of appeasing Russia um, for different reasons. Um, though, is there any truth to this? Yes, there is truth to this, and a lot of the approach of some of the European left is to do with a perception that when Russia is aggressive, an element of that aggression is kind of pushing back against Western imperialism. That's one attitude that dies slowly. Um, so it's kind of seeing one form of imperialism, being critical of it, but then not recognizing a worse form of imperialism. The advice I always have, Nico, for people who are on the left and who are soft on Putin, ask what left wing people think in Ukraine. So, I'm not a socialist, but if you're a socialist, talk to Ukrainian socialists, talk to socialists on Russia's border, and they're not going to give you an appeasement-driven picture. So I think that is true. Um, But I also think that there's plenty of room for appeasement on the right in Europe too, as well as on the left. And the center is still not fully come to terms with the war, in my opinion. In other words, it's still in this kind of pattern of saying, well, if we could wave a magic wand and go back to before the war started, things would be okay. But they wouldn't, because the things that were happening before the war are the things that produced the war. So, but yes, there's a problem on the left. I am tempted to make a main channel video about it at some point, sort of why elements of the left don't express their own position consistently when it comes to this conflict, when it comes to Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. Um, Sri is asking if the regressive right gets elected in the United States. Sorry if there are Trump and DeSantis voters here. There should be a couple of Trump and DeSantis voters here. That needs to be a bit elaborated a bit. But let's say if Trump and DeSantis get elected, how will this impact democracy in the West? And what are the prospects for Ukraine? Trump and DeSantis are very different. Trump can make a very, very big mess at the level of the informational environment. And Trump is very good at getting elected. But Trump is a very, very weak political operator who has very, very poor discipline, very poor clarity of thought. So Trump failed to build an elite around him in his first presidency that aligned with some of the things he was thinking and saying and could properly implement them. This will repeat if Trump gets elected again. DeSantis doesn't have any of the communicative gifts that Trump has. DeSantis is less skillful at appealing in different ways to different segments of the population, but he will be a more effective operator, and he will be able to make more progress at building an elite around him that can implement some of his projects. Some of what we've seen from DeSantis in Florida has authoritarian tendencies. The United States is a complex democracy with many complex institutions. It's like a big ship. You can't turn it around easily. So that's approaching Ukraine now. You can't easily unplug the US position of support for Ukraine. You can unplug it, but it's a bit of a journey. So that's one of the benefits of very institutionally complex societies like that. But obviously, a Trump or DeSantis presidency will not be what Ukrainians want at all. But this is for the American people to decide. Of the two, Trump is much more capable of saying one thing while his administration does the opposite. So, for example, many people who are Russianist, Russia scholars, think that the Trump administration was comparatively tough on Russia, even though that didn't personally represent Trump's own position. John is asking, how has the Ukraine war affected the cultural identities and political attitudes of people living in East European regions? Um, in the eastern regions of the country. Um, Hugely. Um, Nobody's gonna like if bombs are being dropped on you and these bombs are backed by a genocidal rhetoric that says that you don't exist as a culture. Um, so there's very, very strong consolidation in eastern Ukraine against Russian imperialism. Um, and that goes together with people in eastern Ukraine still speaking Russian, right? Um, you know, if you go to Odessa tomorrow, you're going to hear a lot of Russian spoken, but these are Ukrainians speaking Russian, and speaking Russian does not make them Russian any more than me speaking English makes me American. Suzanne is asking, what are your thoughts on an episode that explains different types of socialism? So I'm a political philosopher, I'm a political theorist. It would be painful for me to do that for the main channel because of the enormity of simplification that it is going to entail. I'm sure I'm going to do something like that on the philosophy channel. Um, but eventually, yes. But I'd probably start by talking about liberalism first. And of course, on the channel, like the main channel, Suzanne, people would want to know theory and practice. They'd want to know the connections between what Marx wrote, what Engels wrote, what then many um, sort of theorists who were their descendants in the 20th century wrote, and how that compares to Leninism and various practices um, in communist countries. We could do that. Liam is asking, Vlad, do you have suggestions for how Western democracies um, can come to terms with their colonial past? Um, we have a lot of resources for that. We don't always use them well. Sometimes, well, all too often we use them very fetishistically. I think that the best thing to say here is that you've got to be able to think freely about the um, darkness of colonialism, short of making an identity politics out of your thinking about it. That's to say that what we want to do is think our own thoughts and not operate in politically correct cliches. And they've got to acknowledge all kinds of darkness. And they've got to acknowledge that people need to be at the table who previously weren't recognized. And what needs to be recognized isn't just that they're at the table now, but that they weren't at the table before for unlovely reasons. Yeah, I could make a video about how to help family members who have fallen into the trap of simply distrusting all institutions, but it's difficult. Um, the key piece of advice you start with is that you don't start with their damn views. You start at what lies beneath the views, both the social forces that produce these views, for example, certain kinds of um, disempowerment, rejection, disregard, but also psychological forces. Um, why do people have the feelings they have is a better place to start with than, you know, whether their views are completely wrong. Um, that's why I think that uh, it's absolutely essential, especially in these familial conversations, to start with the motivations people actually have and not to have an argument with them in terms of motivations you wished they had, but they don't actually have. Yeah, Suzanne, off the top of my head, I was thinking, is there a good video about this? Um, and online. And there might well be, and I might just be forgetting about it. I'll keep thinking, but either way, we'll get there. So unwashed masses. I when I say the West, I pretty much include Eastern Europe. Um, so that includes, you know, Latvia and Portugal. Um, but I think, you know, your question is important because we've got to ask, what is Europe? How do we see the future of the European space? How do we see the future? We're having real problems visualizing our political futures at the moment. Just think about it. What is the political future of your country? What's the vision there? It's quite terrifying how absent that is. That's not normal. That's not normal. Um, Throughout the majority of the 20th century, there was a picture of the future. It was often delusional. There was a picture of the future, and people thought they're kind of working toward it. We have a real crisis here, um, and we've got to engage with that too. Monsieur Nothing is saying today many struggle to deal with political opponents without rejecting them as entirely aberrant. How do you personally cope with those you righteously disagree with? Well, um, I would talk to anybody who doesn't threaten violence or practice violence. Um, I mean, I also take responsibility for them if they're fellow citizens. Um, I think that it's very important to start with the thought that people come to the table of politics from different backgrounds, with different perspectives and different concerns in different historical periods. And we're now in a period where we're experiencing levels of political instability that weren't there 20 years ago. That's going to make our tables of politics even more divisive. Tables of politics aren't there to sing kumbaya and agree with everyone. They are there to keep the damn show on the road. And it's very important that if I close my eyes um, to my political opponents and pretend they don't exist just because I think they're irrational, they aren't going to go away. They're still going to be there. You cannot sort of uh, get out of that one. Um, you know, if you don't like um, what Donald Trump means for democracy or for the climate crisis or whatever, um, and you're a US American, Trump voters are fellow citizens, their actual feelings matter. You can't abstract them away by calling them irrational. Because if you do, they're still going to be there, and they're going to be voting, and quite rightly so. And that's a very, very important idea. And it's an idea, this wide table of politics is an idea that becomes very difficult to properly grasp if you are doing hyper identity politics, whereby um, you say, I'm not going to sit at that table unless conditions XYZ are met. But they're not going to be met. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to engage in certain kinds of political theater that are not going to be necessarily constructive. Um, so that table of politics is a very uncomfortable place. And it's a place that requires the value of toleration. And what we tolerate what we dislike. Toleration is a negative value. Um, and one of the struggles we've got at the moment is that um, our circle of political opinion, political sentiment, including destructive political sentiment, is very wide at the moment. We have to recognize that that's where we are. We can't just pretend that that circle is here, and that yes, there are people here and here who have aberrant views, and yes, they're there, but like screw them because they're irrational. The real circle is here, because unless you're a moron, you wouldn't really think any of these things. You'd just be here. Well, that doesn't work. Um, and so it's very important, and I'm like a broken record here, that you deal with the emotions citizens actually have, not with the emotions you would like them to have. And as somebody in Britain who voted Remain in our little um, conflict that we've had in this country over the last few years, um, I am often disappointed by fellow Remainers who just think that, you know, people who voted Brexit are irrational, and that if only they'd thought about it properly, they wouldn't have done it, and that therefore uh, there's a sense in which we can just sort of write them out of the equation of what we would like our public discourse to look like. But you can't do that. So I take responsibility for people who voted Brexit. Um, I lost that political debate and that political decision. Um, but I take responsibility for the outcome, even though I don't like it one bit, because I live in Europe psychologically. I don't even live in Britain in my mind. Um, but I take responsibility for a decision that went against me. Um, and I deal with the actual feelings people have. So this is rambly, but this is some of the directions we need to go in. Joshua, are there any political views that you believe can't have a place at the table without fundamentally destroying it? I think that there are certain policies that can't have a place, but debates about them typically can have a place. Um, the debates that have no place are debates that um, basically threaten violence. Directly or to some extent, maybe in some less direct extent. And then beyond that, you've got to be very careful about shutting things down. I think all things being equal, unless you're threatening violence, you speak and I listen. I might reject what you're saying, but I listen and I do share the table of politics. But if you want to just throw something at my head, something heavy, then no, we can't talk. And I will want you removed from that table of politics. But we've got to keep that as minimal as possible. If the bar of entry to the table of politics is too high, then most citizens end up being left out. And then what do you do with your discourse? Just represents a segment of the population. So Beautiful community. We're going to gently begin winding down. Very grateful to you all for this conversation. Um, Greg, dialectical materialism is maybe for the philosophy channel. Last one from John. No more super thanks, please, because we're winding down. Last question, if it is a question I can answer. What misconceptions about Ukraine, Russia did you hold before beginning your studies? How did your research or experiences change your perspectives? All my studies at all degree levels were in political philosophy. They weren't in Russia or Ukraine studies. Um, One of the fascinating stories about Ukraine is this anti-colonial movement, and Ukraine's coming of age politically in some ways, around 2014 and on. And it was important. It was important not to miss that. Um, I mean, one of the things your question is making me think of is, did I misunderstand the Putin regime early on? I have an image of over 20 years ago now, I think. No, I think about 20 years ago, being um, in a room, some kind of room, in what used to be the politics school at Oxford. I was a postgrad, and I was washing dishes with Sir Adam Roberts, who is an important IR theorist, who has, I think, even done a critical response recently to Mearsheimer, an economist. And I was lecturing him about analogies and disanalogies between early Putinism and Tsar Alexander II. I was very skeptical, I must say, of early Putinism, indeed. Partly because in the 90s, a lot of my consumption of Russian news and Russian information came from an independent channel called NTV at the time, that got shut down very early in the Putin regime, very early in Putin's reign. And that was a channel very, very critical of Putin. And I was very conscious of the Chechen war and the Yeltsin and under Putin. So I was very skeptical about Putin. But what I'd add is that once you have the kind of situation that happened when he came back, you're lost. Just doesn't matter who you are or what your project is. I mean, if you essentially install yourself as a monarch who can't be deselected, you're screwed. Then the other thing I would say, and this is for the next video on the main channel actually, did I have some anti-Ukrainian prejudices as a child growing up in the Soviet Union. I'm sure I had a few, yeah. You know, um, but that's the sort of stuff I'm going to touch on, I think, in the next video on the main channel. I think that you were inclined to think that Ukraine was kind of peripheral, and that the Ukrainian language might be is a kind of a derivative of Russian. So I believed any of that, but there was an atmosphere in which such thoughts were swimming about, and so it's a fascinating question how far I was imbued with that. So I left the Soviet Union. I was about 9.5. So I'm sure there was prejudice worth exploring there in the air. Um, I spent a little tiny bit of time in Ukraine in the 90s. Interesting. I'm rambling. Let's wind things down with a very super last question now, for sure, 100% for sure, definitely. Um, how do you manage to keep calm if and when you feel people are being intellectually challenging? Because here I'm in a kind of public intellectual role, and so it's not my business to get. I mean, I sometimes get mad demonstratively at people, but not really. I could write a comment that's a bit sort of eviscerating to somebody, and I say, "Well, haven't you watched the video? Because this question has been answered there, or this has been dealt with, and you're saying it clearly hasn't been." Um, but basically, it's not. Um, somebody in the community interacting with me is not responsible to know everything I know. I don't have that. I don't have that expectation. So it'd be bizarre. Um, it'd be bizarre if I got worked up by somebody who knows 4% of what I know, telling me I'm an idiot and I'm wrong. That would be bizarre. So I don't. Meanwhile, in my philosophy world, we eviscerate each other all the time, but nobody gets triggered because that's just part of the course with that micro community, if you like, the community of professional philosophers. Everybody, thank you. I don't know how you tolerate me, because this was very, very rambly and meandery, but I'm grateful to you all. I've stolen you away from sleep if you're in Europe. I've stolen you away from work or Trump if you're in the United States. Don't know what I've stolen you away from if you're in different parts of the world, but sending you lots and lots of love, and hope to share a video about Russian imperialist psychology among Russian opposition on the main channel in some days, hopefully soonishly. Sorry that's been so delayed, and we'll just be connected on here too. Thank you so much. Night, everybody, or good morning if you're on the other side of the world. Bye bye for now.